Now entering Nerdist.com.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. Episode 50. Patterns of Force.
Hello, people. Welcome to the most efficient podcast Earth has ever known. It's Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm Ken Ray.
And I'm John Champion. Each week, we look at a single episode of Star Trek and pick it apart to find the morals, meanings, and messages that lay within.
This week, we visit the planet Ekos. It's got it bad for Germany in the 1940s, and that can't be good. It's Patterns of Force. Though, don't bother checking the Simplicity catalog. You'll not find that pattern there.
I like the idea of a pattern of force. I think if you look at my parents' closet from the 1970s, there were a lot of patterns of force on those clothes.
Now, wait, are we talking about horribly garish designs, or are we talking about something we don't want to talk about when we're talking about anybody's parents?
No, we're talking about, plaid polyester pants.
Oh, okay.
I think that would be a pattern of force.
Oh, okay. Because I did not want to have the other conversation.
No, you did not. Nor did I.
So, Nazis, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know nothing. It's, is it too soon today?
Right.
And then, oh my goodness, is it too soon in 1968?
Yeah, I took some notes about that I think we'll get to later in the show, because it's kind of like when we were talking about gangsters on Star Trek. Like there's this weird, cultural pendulum that swings where at one point they're funny, at one point they're scary. This was on the air at the same time as Hogan's Heroes.
Yes.
And they were having fun with Nazis, making fun of Nazis. But, it was very strange.
Rest assured, though, Star Trek does not, this is not a Nazi comedy the way...
No.
the way, with the gangsters, that was sort of a gangster comedy. This is not a Nazi comedy episode of Star Trek. You have to go to Next Gen for that.
Oh, dear.
And I'm pretty sure that didn't happen on Next Gen. But we haven't gotten there yet, so, stay with us for a few years and we'll find out.
No, but you can tell us if we're right or wrong about that assumption about the funny Nazi episode in Next Gen.
Don't write us about that, please. But yeah, go ahead. John was going to say you can write us about almost anything else. John?
You can. And you can find us on Facebook, Skype, and Twitter. All your social media belong to us at Mission Log Pod. Again, that handle is Mission Log Pod. Or you can call us on the telephone like they used to do. 323-522-5641. Again, that number is 323-522-5641. You can email us, missionlog@roddenberry.com, and you can also check us out on the web at www.missionlogpodcast.com. Remember, we may use your comments in an upcoming episode of Mission Log.
You are so hip with the dub.
You like that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're like dub-stepping.
Right. Boy, that's a reference that won't be dated.
Yes, good point. Something that never goes out of style, though, because you're right.
What's that,
you're
Ken?
right. My comments du jour may not make any sense, 3, 5, 7 minutes from now.
Right.
But what never goes out of style, John Champion, is trivia.
Hey, well, since you mentioned it, I would love to share some trivia with you. We heard from a listener, Eli, a few weeks before recording this show, who wanted to point out that, of course, both William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy are both Jewish. And here they are playing out in this kind of fantasy version of the Third Reich. Also wanted to point out that Leonard Nimoy performed in and produced a TV movie, which I believe came out in 1991, called Never Forget. And in that, he plays a Jew who suffered during the war in the concentration camps and ended up taking a group of Holocaust deniers to court and winning that court case. So very interesting film there. Also wanted to mention that Skip Homeyer, who played Melicon, also will appear later in Star Trek in a very different role in the season 3 episode, The Way to Eden. So be sure you listen to that one. Now, this episode, Patterns of Force, was banned from German TV when it first came out. This was released in 1968 originally. It did not play in Germany until the 1990s on pay TV only, and then finally was broadcast only in late 2011. So it took a very long time for this episode to make it to the German population at large.
Gosh, why?
Yeah, well, yeah. Who knows? Who knows? A couple of things to point out about this show. The character Eneg, you might notice, is Gene, spelled backwards. Yes, that was a little reference to Gene Roddenberry. There's lots of stock footage used in this episode to good purpose here, of course. There is a newsreel scene early on, and there's a good amount of World War II vintage footage used during that. And there are tons of studio buildings used here from the Paramount lot / Desilu lot. And by the way, did the underground tunnels used by the Xeon Resistance, did they maybe look like they were carved out by a Horta to you, Ken? Because they were.
Were they? Wow.
Yes.
Good. So the Horta found work after that one episode.
Yes. Or at least the set builders from Devil in the Dark found their set reused. So that tunnel indeed was a Horta tunnel. And we also would like to point out to you the discovered document that goes along with this episode. We have a shooting schedule. And the thing that I liked looking at in this shooting schedule for Patterns of Four. So there are the notes in there that you would expect to see, like wardrobe for Kirk and Spock, and then there are doubles who appear throughout, and all kinds of interesting props, like the Lugers that are carried, the broken apart communicators, stuff like that I thought was pretty cool. And then the camera notes that you would expect to see, like tie-down camera, for example, for the scenes where anytime anybody's materialized, they are beamed down to the planet. You have to lock down the camera in order to get that effect to work correctly. Or the bit where they superimpose the newsreel featuring John Gill, that is a lockdown shot, so you can, of course, fix that overlay with the effect in there. And then, classically, of course, there's a camera direction to shake camera when they are on the bridge.
If history has taught us anything, it is this. Don't take a history class with John Gill. Let's let John Champion tell us why.
Prologue. The Enterprise is en route to Ecos, a planet where Earth historian John Gill has been hanging out, but no one seems to have heard from him. Ecos is relatively undeveloped, but as they approach, a rocket with a nuclear warhead approaches and explodes when the Enterprise phasers blow it up. Something is not right. Act 1. No word from John Gill, so Kirk and Spock decide to beam down to have a look around. They go for street clothes rather than their usual uniforms to try to blend in, just in case Dr. McCoy plants a transponder under the skin of both of them. If they get into trouble, at least they can be found. They beam down to Ecos, and it is a quaint, almost European replica of mid-20th century Earth. It might even be a nice place to stay if the Earth-like conditions didn't also include what seems to be a replica of Nazi Germany. They hide as they watch a young man, Isak, from the planet Xeon get harassed by uniformed Nazi thugs. Then, watching a newsreel broadcast, they see that the similarities of Nazi Germany are strikingly accurate, but in charge of it all seems to be John Gill, no longer a historian, but now in charge as the Fuhrer. Spock has caused a soldier to pass out using a Vulcan nerve pinch, and in short order, Kirk gets his own uniform as well. They are on their way to headquarters to get an audience with the Fuhrer himself and end whatever is going on here. The ruse is short-lived, though. A higher-ranking official sees Spock and asks him to take off his helmet. Even on Ecos, Vulcans don't look like they belong. Kirk and Spock are captured. Act 2. Kirk and Spock find themselves in a dungeon where they are being whipped and interrogated. Kirk just wants to talk to the Fuhrer. Chairman Eneg walks in to take over the interrogation and spots right away that Spock is not from Xeon. Kirk says he'll talk, but only to the Fuhrer. On top of all this, If it was bad enough when a hobo found McCoy's phaser last year, or when 1920s gangsters got a hold of a communicator, now this new Reich has found the equipment Kirk and Spock beamed down with and are trying to figure out what makes it tick. Stuck in their jail cell, Kirk and Spock are right next to Isak, who was taking a beating on the street when they beamed down. He explains that the Zeons were trying to civilize the Ecosians, but the Nazi movement started a few years ago. The Zeons are so peaceful they would rather die than engage in a fight, but the Nazis need a common enemy to give them purpose. Kirk starts to hatch a plan. They need to get back their original equipment in the SS lab, so they hatch a plan to remove the transponders from their bodies and use the light in their cell to form a crude laser. I'll let you all take a break for about 10 minutes to imagine all the tense but comedic bumbling that follows. Are we good now? Okay, Kirk and Spock are out of their cell. They overpower a guard. Hey, another new uniform. And they take Isak with them, who will help them get back their equipment. The phasers are gone, but the communicators are in pieces. Isak urges his new friends to escape with him to the underground. It's not such a warm welcome. Isak introduces Kirk and Spock to Abram, who reveals the terrible news that Isak's fiancée was killed by Ecosians. Isak is still not driven to violence, lest they become like the Nazis themselves. While Spock gets to work on the communicators, a group of Ecosians break in, led by a woman, the same woman they saw in the newsreel earlier, to break up the party. Act 3. Kirk and Spock are still in their Nazi uniforms that they stole while trying to escape the prison, and they are being held at gunpoint by Daris, the young woman from the newsreel. She's overpowered by the two, but Isak stops them. This was a test. She's really one of them, working from the inside. Kirk reveals what's going on, who John Gill really is, and that something went wrong. Isak tells Kirk that the Fuhrer is never seen by anyone except Melikon, a high-ranking official. The Fuhrer does have a speech tonight, though, and the best chance of seeing him will be to infiltrate his building while posing as a film crew. When Spock peeks into the broadcast booth, he sees that John Gill is stiff and in a catatonic state. Kirk decides he'll need McCoy to help figure out what's going on, so they hide in a cloakroom to call the Enterprise and have him beamed down. The Nazis are onto them, though. The reconstructed communicator that Spock repaired was working on a lower frequency, and they spotted the radio signal. Just after McCoy beams in, dressed as a Nazi as well, the group are interrupted by Chairman Eneg. Act 4. Seeing Daris in the cloakroom, Eneg buys the story that this Nazi doctor is drunk and leaves them alone. When the speech begins, the crew are watching along with the other gathered officials, but Spock points out that Gill's mouth isn't moving, and the content of the speech just seems to be random sentences, probably pre-recorded. McCoy says he looks drugged, but he'll need a closer look. They all leave and overpower the guards who are stationed in front of the broadcast booth containing Gill. In the room outside, Melikon has already begun his speech, so no one notices what's going on with Gill once the curtains are closed. McCoy calls it. Gill has been drugged. At Kirk's urging, he administers a stimulant to Gill to bring him around. If we know one thing about McCoy, he's always ready to pump you full of stimulants. It's working, but not enough, and Spock initiates a mind meld. As they are listening to Melikon's speech, Daris asks Kirk to use the Enterprise's weapons to destroy the fleet of Ecosian ships that would be launched against Zeon. He's reluctant to take any more lives, and he points out that Zeon may survive. But what about Akos? After Spock's mind meld, Gill is in a state where he can answer questions. He explains to Kirk that the planet was in bad shape when he arrived. He thought that he could take a lesson from the efficiency of Nazi Germany and apply it in a benevolent way. Melikon took over, though, and perverted the system while keeping him drugged. At that moment, Eneg and his guards come into the broadcast booth, and Kirk decides to use Spock as a distraction, passing him off as a spy. Isak, in disguise as the Nazi, seconds this and quietly reveals to Kirk that Eneg is actually one of them. Melikon is having fun with this. He starts theorizing about Spock's relative purity and genetic inferiority. Back in the booth, Kirk is alone with Gill, and if you thought McCoy liked giving out stimulants, then Kirk takes this to a whole new level. There's injecting, and then for good measure, a few slaps to the face to bring him around. Once awake enough, Gill agrees to broadcast a call to stop the aggression and keep the Ecosian ships in place. He also names Melikon as the traitor. Millikan grabs a machine gun and fires directly toward the broadcast booth, killing Gill, but not before Gill can tell Kirk he was wrong. The Prime Directive really is a good policy. I sure hope Kirk learns from this. Darius and Ineg will take to the airwaves and start to repair the damage to their worlds. Time for our crew to beam back aboard, and even Spock says he thinks the Zeons and Ecosians, once they can work together, would make a fine addition to the Federation. Back in the captain's chair, Kirk explains to Spock where Gill went wrong, that the problem with the Nazis wasn't just that they were evil, but that the old axiom about absolute power holds true. The leader principle is what corrupted these people. And before a knockout war of words can erupt between McCoy and Spock, Kirk gives the order to leave orbit. The end.
So how do you want to do this episode?
Well, that's an interesting question, Ken. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, never mind. We should actually do the lighter stuff first, and then maybe we'll start the next segment with that question.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Can I go ahead and break the timeline like we always do?
Yeah.
Spock's examination of gambling and the exhilaration associated with the risk was very reminiscent of the conversation between Data and Picard as they march on the Borg in First Contact.
Oh,
it just totally reminded me of that. The second he started doing that, wow, I'm sort of getting this whole gambling thing. This is when Data has his emotion chip, which I think he got in Generations, or they got it to work properly in Generations.
Right.
And so the next movie is First Contact, and he's, walking around emoting all over the place. He's emo Data. Not exactly, but you get the idea.
Yes.
And so they've got guns, and they're going to fight the Borg, maybe die against the Borg. And while they're at the head of this, like a group of gunmen, Data's all like, "Oh, Captain, this is really whoa! I'm feeling like I'm kind of exhilarated. I'm kind of frightened, but it's kind of neat. Kind of like that whale falling towards Magrathea in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And it's like, whoa, what's this? I mean, whoa, kind of crazy. And Picard's like, turn it off." Got it. It reminded me of that a little bit because there's no reason that Spock should be standing there going, "Hey, I'm kind of whoa.
Hey, this gambling is great."
Yeah, the risk associated is kind of nutty. Although Kirk actually encourages Spock, saying, "Hey, we'll make a human of you yet." Mm-hmm. Yeah, which of course gives Spock a chance to dig at humans.
He's going to take him back to the Enterprise and open a casino just so he can explore this even more. Hey, there's something just kind of from a production standpoint. The Ecosians, as described earlier in the episode, were primitive and warlike before John Gill got there. That's all that Starfleet really, or the Federation, knows about them. And the Zeons were advanced. But what were they doing on each other's planets anyway? We have gas-burning cars. We have these old-style movie cameras. Everything is just right out of, whatever the studio had from the 1940s, which is obviously very clever from a production point of view. But I kind of wish that there had been a little tip to the higher technology that the Zeons had. Because it's kind of like the Zeons were there hiding out amongst them to fit in with this 1940s look. But they had spaceships. They had to get from their planet to this other planet.
Well, we have spaceships and gas-burning cars.
Well, we do, yeah, but we also have things like iPhones and computers and
but we didn't
advanced things.
I mean, we went to the moon in 1969. We went to the moon a year after this. So at that point, the height of most of the technology that we have is color television, but we're also able to go from one body in space to another body in space. Now, we haven't gone to another planet as people yet, but of course there are no people on Mars as far as we know.
Sure.
If there were, we might have maybe, driven a little harder, or we might be driving a little bit harder to get there.
Yeah. Well, it seemed a little weird to me that we're describing these things. We're saying like, oh, yeah, they go from this planet all the time, and we're about to launch a fleet to this other planet. But all we actually see is just what we know of late 30s, early 40s Germany.
Well, you're leaving off the nuclear warhead that flew in space against the Enterprise.
Well, yeah, we see that.
Yeah.
We have that one.
I get what you're saying, but I mean, this sort of goes back to a couple of weeks ago with the Private Little War, which I think we might hit on again later, but it sort of goes to that whole, did we get there at the time when they should have been going from bows and arrows to flintlocks? You know what I mean? I mean, because the 60s especially, but we are still sort of in a period of transition between what we have and theoretically what we can have. I guess you're always
Sure,
that way
sure.
if you're a human, though. Unless you're like feeding Vol or, sucking up spores or something like that. Generally speaking, we're always, sort of like 5 minutes from the next big thing.
Right. 5 minutes into the future. That's where I want to live.
I go for 20, personally.
Okay.
But a little bit cleaner.
Zing. Nazi. By the way, if you can say Klingon or Klingon, then I say they're both perfectly acceptable pronunciations.
Yeah, either one's fine. Well, I mean, neither one is fine, but either one's fine.
Well, right. Hey, I called it out in my story wrap-up, but did you, since we watched these shows a few times before we record, when you got to the moment in the jail cell with creating the laser, did you get up and go make a sandwich and then come back?
I didn't. I mean, I will tell you honestly, what I noticed is I can't remember if the measurement was supposed to be 22.7 millimeters or 27.2 millimeters. But the problem is a measurement that small is not going to read well on camera. So he actually just makes it about an inch, which
Right.
I think. And, I didn't actually get I've got a ruler right here. I guess I could check it. But I'm thinking that no way that's going to happen. Also, so let me get this straight. Light passing between a gem on the left and a gem on the right is going to make a laser that shoots in the middle?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What I actually didn't understand is why not just, bide for time? Because the whole reason for the subcutaneous, radio beacon thing is that the Enterprise is going to pass by and beam them out.
Right.
So why not just make stuff up? Oh, I'll tell you about our plans. It's a long story, though. Do you have 1 hour and 58 minutes?
Exactly.
Because you're really going to love how the story ends.
Yeah. How about we sit here and we wait, we get beamed up, and we beam back down with more phasers. That'll help.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something like that. And we'll take one of you with us just for show.
Sure. Exactly. John Gill can't talk. He can't form new thoughts, but he can answer questions.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of a weird choice.
Well, that's one of the, Yeah. The Vulcan's ability to play with the mind is a bit like, again, I think I've mentioned this before, not about the Vulcan mind, but sort of like the room of requirement. Like whatever we need the Vulcan superpower to be that week, that's what it is. And so I really don't have a problem with it because we've seen it enough. I mean, once Spock was able to, control the guy's mind through the wall.
Yeah, right.
Or when he feels the death of 400 Vulcans in a whole other part of the galaxy.
Yeah.
I go, okay, it's the thing. It's the easy way out. I'm really more impressed with John Gill. As a historian, not only can he totally recreate the Nazi Party, he can also guide let's go ahead and call it a civilization. He can also guide a civilization to guided nuclear spacefaring missile production, as we mentioned earlier. Now, I know some of that technology came from Echoes, but I think it was Bones who said that's years, generations ahead of where they should be. So, John Gill, multifaceted individual, not always the most forward-thinking, I think.
Yeah, if he only had a few years to do it, I don't think that building a nuclear warhead would have been the first of my priorities. Well, I probably would have done different things, and then,
He was a multitasker.
He was. And by the way, it was such a short scene. But I really like the moment where they bring Spock out of the broadcast booth and present him to Melicon, and then Darius is sort of egging him on, like, "Oh well, Melicon's an expert on these things. Why don't you tell us about the genetic inferiority of this rare prize?" And Melicon sort of sizes him up, and he's saying, "Well, clearly the lowered forehead means that he's." He's not mentally developed, and he has a sinister look. And I thought this was a nice little stab at the whole idea of trying to size people up for purity or superiority or inferiority, because, of course, from our point of view, the Vulcans are superior in so many ways to humans. So I thought it was a fun little scene for them to get in there.
Seriously? With all of the technological power and insight that comes with centuries of development and exploration, the best John Gill could come up with is Nazis?
So I will begin this segment, John, the way I began the outro of your intro, or your recap, rather. How do you want to do this episode? And I think you asked me why I was asking that.
Yeah.
I mean, we could nitpick over what's wrong historically.
Oh, sure.
Or we could go ahead and just get to the topics.
Well, okay, but here's the thing. If we try to nitpick what's wrong historically, I think you always come back to the idea of saying, well, this is so close, so similar, but it is an alien planet and everything is filtered through John Gill. So whether he purposely changed things or purposely or unconsciously just got nitpicks right or wrong, I think you can always kind of come back to that and justify the things that are wrong.
Okay, maybe I apologize. Maybe I misstated my question then. Let me try it a different way. Darius grew up. Darius, who we're going to guess is, I mean, let's say, minimum 18. Although I think she's much older than that. But let's say
I think the actress was about 25 at the time.
Okay, so Darius is about 25 years old. She grew up revering John Gill. Kirk is out of Starfleet and been serving aboard starships for 13, 14 years at this point. He had John Gill as a professor at Starfleet. Is Starfleet on like a 20-year program? Because there's no way that he could have been here and actually raised up the society that he was raising up and had people grow up, people Darius's age, grow up and respect him.
Yeah.
And still Kirk's path and Gill's paths have crossed. So
That's a good point.
Do we just go ahead and dispense with the whole, I mean, we do the Doctor Who thing and say that, time is wibbly wobbly in this episode because there's no way. I mean, just there, it doesn't work. And
maybe, just maybe, the Akoshians grow up really fast. Like there's a period that they are childlike, and then just boom, they're adults. They could have a whole different evolution.
All right, that's fine. Okay, I'm okay with that. That's what I didn't. No, that's great because that's what I don't want to spend this episode doing. So
there you go.
So that's how we're going to do this episode. We're just going to ignore the parts that actually don't work as far as continuity and what have you.
Yeah, I think we have to.
And get to the party, by which I of course mean the Nazi party, which is not nearly as fun.
So, well, let's talk about that, though. So the immediate thing, and we brought it up earlier about Hogan's Heroes and all this stuff, is the idea of doing, light versus serious entertainment about World War II and the very real atrocity of the Nazis. And so I kept kind of thinking, well, where does this episode really fall in that spectrum? Star Trek is a serious show about serious issues, but it is also an entertainment show designed to appeal to a wide audience, kids and adults alike. And I think that, as weird an idea of Hogan's Heroes is, there was this sort of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. There's this tradition of making fun of the things that are difficult to deal with. Ernst Lubitsch did it with To Be or Not to Be. Charlie Chaplin did it with The Great Dictator, although he did it right before we really understood what was going on with Hitler. He was making fun of the idea of Hitler, the totalitarian. He said that he would have never made that movie if he had known the true horrors that were then revealed about the death camps.
Really?
So
that's interesting because I mean that movie was made. The Great Dictator was 1940, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean that actually seems to me. I always assumed that he had an idea, what with his being British, of some of the horrors that were going on. Obviously not the horrors of the death camps, as you say, but I mean he had a clear idea. Being from the UK, I don't think you're supposed to say the UK is Europe, even though it is, but don't tell anybody from the UK because they get a little upset. I mean, being from Europe, he had a clear idea of how dangerous Hitler was, and so it seemed to me that he was sending out just a serious, like, point-blank message, hey, there's a lot of bad stuff going on to which we need to pay attention.
Well, and he was, and I didn't mean to downplay that, but yeah, he was absolutely, and he was pointing at, obviously directly at Hitler and about the danger of that totalitarian government, but the other stuff that was revealed about what was going on there with the death camps, and he said that he would not have made fun the way that he did. Yeah, because this was too serious to make fun of. But here we are with Star Trek then in this kind of weird spot where this is not serious, heavy drama. we'll kind of get to that because I feel like the show is not really about the Nazis, but it's definitely not at the other end of the spectrum where we're making fun of. We're doing like the light version. So it is in this strange spot, and I feel like a lot of that has to do with the period in which it was shot. It is, like you said, not much more than 20 years after the people watching this show were there and had gone through this.
Right.
So you kind of have to treat this with a little bit of a bit of care to make sure you're not going down the wrong path here and still make it entertaining. I feel like what we're doing here is this is really more about the game, about Kirk and Spock getting captured and discovered and then getting out and fixing what's wrong.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I mean, the messaging in this is so heavy, though.
Well, no, I think I know where you're going with this. I don't want to be misconstrued here. The message is there, and certainly we will be able to get into the messages about power and corruption and all of this stuff. But I think just as a show, if you're just watching the show, the experience of watching the show is about the adventure. I think the emphasis is there on the adventure.
I disagree.
Okay.
I mean, I think the problem is this message. I mean, this is a fresh wound for a lot of people. Even, I mean, it's only been 22 years. It's only been 23 years from where you and I sit right now. And this is a very different thing. They're not comparable. But I mean, it does not take more than maybe 10 minutes for me to get ridiculously depressed about what happened on September 11th, 2001.
Sure.
At all. And that was, one day and a much smaller number of people. It was a very different kind of thing. But, I mean, you say, well, it's been 23 years. That's a fresh wound for people watching it at that point. Mm-hmm. So I think in that respect, you've got more of an emphasis maybe on the swashbuckling. And certainly you do have a bit more levity than I personally like in my Star Trek episodes. We mentioned in the last segment the whole thing where Spock's like, "Whoa, gambling, yeah, that kind of thing." And we get McCoy gets to act drunk. And isn't that always fun? I mean, there's it's heavy on the action, or heavy at least on the game, as you say, and on the sort of swashbuckling kind of thing. And certainly they get to knock out a bunch of Nazis, kind of like Ewoks knocking out stormtroopers. I mean, it's just way too easy to knock out this warrior race on this planet. But I think you get that emphasis because of how fresh these wounds are.
Yeah, well, and that's my whole thing. I'm trying to contextualize this and it being light versus heavy entertainment about something that is dreadfully serious. And then that's kind of my impression of the production, is to say, well, we need to emphasize the adventure aspect, the banter between Kirk and Spock, the bit with Bones, all of this stuff, because otherwise we would be doing something that would just be depressing and heavy. And then the exploration about power and about John Gill and about all of this stuff, that's where then we kind of get to explore it seriously, but we're also doing it from this kind of theoretical standpoint. Here's the real world stuff, and then we're going to look at it from this theoretical idea of what is power, what happens to power, etc.
I think I'm getting what you're saying. The problem that I'm having is, I mean, okay, so why Nazis in this episode? I mean, I know why Indiana Jones goes up against the Nazis, because we're setting in the 1930s, and that's just awesome. I mean, and then the 1940s later on, and then sadly in the 1950s, and yet there are still Nazis that Indy's fighting, but that's a completely different thing. Are the Nazis just shorthand here? Because it's not like, this is not like The Great Dictator. It is not like the Nazi Party is rising again, and so Star Trek is going to say, hey, remember, these guys are bad.
Yeah.
I mean, why Nazis? Why not so John Gill took part of what they did. I mean, because this is the thing. It's hard to say that it's not about World War II, and it's not about the Nazis, because the Zeons are Zionists.
Yep.
I mean, the guy's name is Isaac.
Yeah.
I mean, and his brother's name is Abraham. Oh, I'm sorry, Abram. I mean, this is very much about that, and yet oh, not.
Right. Well, I'm trying to piece that together. That's kind of the challenge of watching this episode, is that part of it is shorthand. Part of it is, I think, a budget thing as well, where it's very easy to go down to Western costume and get a bunch of Nazi uniforms. I mean, seriously, you could do that.
Right.
You remember in the 80s, the miniseries V?
Yeah.
All right. So in V, you have this alien race who are actually lizards in disguise as humans, and they come down, and even their symbol looks like a swastika.
Yes.
And the original miniseries, it kind of changed a bit after that, but the original miniseries really heavily explored this idea of the Holocaust, and you even had a Jewish character, an old man who was a Jewish character who had been through the Holocaust in Germany, and he's the one calling this out to his children and grandchildren, saying, no, this has happened before. We have to be careful about this. But that's a piece of science fiction that approaches the idea but makes it into science fiction. This, I agree with you, is very strange. Like, why do we make it literally Nazis?
Yeah.
Even with a few changes, you could have kept the idea, kept it as metaphor, but not just put it right there in front of you, so there's absolutely no room for interpretation or discovery, which I think is kind of strange.
Unless what you need is that fresh wound feel. I mean, if you want to go ahead and get quickly to your message.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you, and forgive me, I know it sounds like we're getting stuck on this. I agree with you, this is not exactly about the Nazis. And certainly we'll get into what it might actually be about. Maybe we should go ahead and do that.
Sure. Let's talk about it. Yeah.
So in this episode, we get at the very least a double shot of the policy of leave it the heck alone, also known as the policy of non-interference. Triple shot if you count John Gill saying at the end, "Hey, it's an awesome idea, the policy of leave it the heck alone."
Yeah.
Zeon was trying to civilize the Ecosians. Oh, well, there's your first mistake. When they've destroyed us, says Isak, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, I'm sure now, they'll attack our planet. They'll use the technology we gave them, and killing is so repugnant to us, we'll, probably just going to get killed ourselves. Though I think now I could kill. So great. Trying to grow others might better them, or it might lower you. And also meet Al-Qaeda. Because what it made me think of is, okay, so they tried to raise up these people, not against an enemy, but they tried to raise up these people, and now those people are going to take what they, learned from them and take what they got from them and throw it back in their face. We armed fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and, they win, and we leave, and, we left the weapons. But this takes us back to a private little war where we really couldn't leave Afghanistan hanging in the wind when the Soviets invaded, because, had they won, then there go the dominoes that we were worried about in Vietnam, right? Then again, the excursion didn't work so well for the Soviets either. So, bottom line, leave it the heck alone. And that's kind of like our first, part of that. Bringing it back to this episode, though. So Zeon tries to civilize Ecos. That's a non-starter. So here comes John Gill, sent in as a cultural observer.
Right.
Now, I think maybe you send a sociologist, not a historian, if you're going to do that, but okay. Things apparently were so muffed that he couldn't just stand by and watch. He had to do something, so much as his young protege might have done. His young protege, of course, being Kirk.
Yeah.
Given the proper circumstances, John Gill elects to disregard Starfleet orders and make a cultural concoction of hate and fancy dress.
Yeah, well, and so let's talk about John Gill, okay?
Yeah.
Because what you just described, that is the catalyst for the story. We don't get the story without just saying that this is what happened. And every time I'm confronted with that, I say, but John Gill, first of all, he's described as brilliant, okay?
Right.
And he's a historian. And Spock, in the very beginning, in this conversation with McCoy, says, John Gill is great because he looks at history not as a series of dates, but as cause and effect.
Right.
And all of this stuff means that he's probably the guy who would tell you that Nazi Germany was bad, and we don't want to have a repeat of that anywhere, anytime, on any planet.
You would think.
You would think.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to figure out. So we are told, as you pointed out in your recap, that it's Melicon that is actually driving the hate against Zeon,
right?
And not John Gill, not the Fuhrer,
right?
So what did he use to motivate them? Hey, you guys are crazy. This planet's nuts. This planet's in chaos. So let's pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And forgive the boot reference. I mean, it was largely hatred of the Jews that helped Hitler rise to power, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, and they say that in there that this is sort of the hatred of Zeon is the thing that holds the Ecosians together.
But we're led to believe that it was Melicon who introduced that part, not John Gill. So right. John Gill starts the Nazi Party, but the Nazi Party is pretty much just a betterment of society party, and it's only his underling later who says, what would really make this, what would really drive this motor? Hate.
Yeah.
Of other. Hate of something besides us.
And I find it very hard to believe that John Gill's implementation of Nazism stopped at uniforms and Volkswagens. And
yet we're led to believe that it did.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's okay. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, no, I mean, I think we needed to talk about that because it was very. It's just strange. It's one of those things you have to just sort of swallow about the episode. Speaking of, as you did at the beginning, the nitpick. I think that is a big nitpick. Is like you sit there and try to figure out, well, what did he do and what did he not learn from his own history class? Yeah.
Okay.
But so some of the interesting things here, I think, this episode, going back to that original idea of where does this fall on the spectrum of heavy or light entertainment, this is a kind of fantasy fulfillment. The movie Inglourious Bastards, Quentin Tarantino's movie about World War II, he gets to replay World War II, but with his own version of the outcome and his own set of heroes and his own set of enemies. And I feel like we're kind of doing that here as well. The good guys, of course, are going to win. And they get to win it in a way where at the very end, these people, the Ecosians, have a change of heart, and there's enough of the good element in the Ecosians, like Darius being, an infiltrator and Ineg being one of them, that they can go on the air and finish what Gill ended with, finish with his speech saying it's not too late to turn this around and we have to stop the aggression. So I like this episode more with that in mind, with that fantasy fulfillment aspect of it. But I think one of the big points here, and I hope I didn't confuse the issue by saying, this episode isn't specifically about Nazis or about World War II, is that I do think that it is about exploring this idea of allowing too much power in any one person or any one government. Several episodes ago, back when we were talking about Khan and all this stuff, you Ken Ray, kind of made this joke of calling me out for being authoritarian.
Yes.
But
I'm sorry. Did I make a joke?
Oh, wait.
Oh, hey, sorry. Go ahead.
But it's a little bit of a mischaracterization. What I was saying is that I can understand that it is easy for people to be swayed by this promise of order and strength. Spock says it in this episode, the efficiency of Nazi Germany that they keep mentioning is that here is a country that was completely in shambles after World War I, and then they very quickly rose to this huge position of power. And they did it through a number of methods, and the efficiency I would call into question because, well, they did a lot of it through stealing and, all these other atrocities that they carried out. But power is seductive, and people very frequently will align themselves just with the powerful winning team, whether or not they ideologically fall into place with everything that team espouses. And now, what's interesting to me about that is that there is current research investigating this idea that says, well, absolute power may not actually corrupt absolutely. What may be the more important factor for individuals, for lack of a better word, is the moral compass. You know, we live in a world where, unfortunately, a lot of morally corrupt people have exercised the power necessary to gain and maintain power. But the idea here that power itself is the bad thing may need to be scrutinized a little bit more.
That's interesting. I will tell you that one thing that I find difficult about doing this show, and I don't mean this particular episode, but I mean the way we have set up Mission Log, is we try not to talk about what happened yesterday in real life. Like, you know, what's been going on this week should, you know, theoretically, we don't want to say it's just like what happened, you know, earlier this month or last month.
Right.
There's something going on right now, though, as we record this, that this reminds me of a bit. You're right. We all want security. We all want, you know, to be on the winning team. I sort of wish we were doing more like the Corbynite maneuver, where we're all going to do what we say we're going to do. We're all going to live by the values that we espouse. There's, and I mean, how, you know what I'm talking about, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
How do we address it? Do we just go ahead and say, hey, people listening, you know, 10 years from now, this is what was going on this month? You've got the guy from the NSA, or the contractor from the NSA, Edward Snowden, basically leaving the country, taking a whole bunch of classified documents with him, and then throwing them out to the world. Right. And I don't know where everybody stands on, well, it's a good thing that the government is actually collecting all of the metadata of all of the phone calls from all of the wireless carriers and just holding on to it for a while, too. They have the ability to listen into conversations that you thought they didn't have the ability to listen into. And they're actually, you know, tapping the conversations and communications of allies around the world. You can go ahead and argue about whether or not you think that is a good thing or a bad thing. It's not who we indicated that we were. Right. And so, yeah, taking that shortcut isn't, I can't say right now that was a bad thing that we did, and thank goodness we're past it, because, you know, first of all, we're right in the middle of it. And second, not everybody thinks it's a bad thing. And, you know, historically, I mean, you'd have to go into literally alternate timelines to know whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing that it was happening now. And yet, indeed, when we see, you know, John Gill did this, he basically took a shortcut to stabilization. And we say, well, that's terrible. And of course, we've learned not to do that. Or, I mean, maybe we haven't. I mean, and so that's definitely the part where this is not just a Nazi episode. I mean, as you and I have said a million times, the great thing about Star Trek is it applies, a good episode of Star Trek applies to today. And the only sad thing about that is you would like to think that the signposts that they put up in 1967 and 68, you know, that we would have, you know, learned to stay on the road at this point. And sadly, even 50 years later as we record it, or close to 50 years later as we record it, we haven't completely. To that end, I love Spock's comment that despite all of his words, John Gill isn't saying anything. And he didn't mean the part where Gill's mouth wasn't moving, which is obvious from the moment. I mean, it's funny to me when Kirk says, look at his mouth. Well, you can't see his mouth, and his body's not moving, and his head's not moving. But that's not even the part that Spock was talking about. He meant the part where it was just a bunch of strong-sounding platitudes rather than a coherent train of thought with a beginning, middle, and end. Thinking as I often do in song, I'm reminded of the Talking Heads tune that includes the verses, you start a conversation you can't even finish. You're talking a lot, but you're not saying anything. That's from the song Psycho Killer. And that's what I was thinking of, is like as the Fuhrer is sitting up there talking a lot, but not literally and figuratively not saying anything.
I loved that moment. It said something about crowd psychology, because we're seeing what's happening, and there's something amusing about all the other people in the audience just rapt applause, just jumping, oh yeah, you know, clapping at everything, and you're listening to the speech. As you and I both did, you go back and listen to it a few times, and you go, wow, there's just nothing there. You know?
And yet that is definitely a speech you could hear at a political rally today, because because I mean, as we've talked about, John Gill actually never spoke against the Zeons. Right. So there's nothing in there that where he says hate's what's going to make us strong. That's Malakon coming up later and saying that. So, I mean, yeah, any one of those things that he said, you could hear it. Democrat, Republican, Independent. You could definitely hear a lot of those platitudes, at any state fair where any guy running for any office is standing up making a speech, or any, fundraiser or political rally too, which is a bummer.
Right.
World War II planet is a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. Also, it is not a nice place to visit.
Patterns of Force is one of those strange episodes. We've talked about a few on this show where the iconography kind of outlives the show itself, like Gamesters of Triskelion and a piece of the action. And this is one of those where if you talk to somebody who's not even really a Star Trek fan, that just have kind of a passing interest in it, and they'll be able to say like, oh yeah, Nazi planet. I remember that episode.
Yeah.
So here we go. We get to revisit it. We get to rewatch it. And we get to really pick it apart. So the first order of business is to figure out if this episode holds up just as an episode on its own. What do you think, Ken?
I almost feel like we need to recuse ourselves from this question. I mean, the problem is what we do is analyze an episode of Star Trek. I mean, that's what we sit down to do every week, is actually, figure out, does this episode work? Mm-hmm. And as I pointed out at the beginning of the last segment, this episode does not work timeline-wise. Mm-hmm. And then the idea of this really smart historian doing this incredibly stupid thing, that doesn't work either. If, however, I were new to Star Trek, or if I were just a casual Star Trek watcher, I would say, yeah, it holds up. I mean, it's got the set, it's got, it's got the horror. We're more removed now than we were, but I mean, there's still something about brown shirts, there's still something about the SS. I mean, there's still something about all this that is scary, that is not good. And so if we weren't geeks sitting here going, well, wait a minute, that would make Kirk like 50.
Right,
I mean,
right.
If we weren't watching it in that way, I would think that this episode would work a lot better. So I would say my guess would be for the average watcher that this episode would hold up. Now, that said, if you are listening to this show, you're not the average watcher. So I don't know actually how it does for most people listening to this episode. And I don't know how it does for you and me. Mm-hmm. But I would say this episode would, I would think that this episode would hold up for the average viewer, except for one thing.
What's that?
Besides Melicon, was there actually a member of the Nazi Party? Because John Gill, he was the leader of the Nazi Party, but he wasn't really a Nazi. He just wanted to make the trains run on time. He wasn't actually looking to, kill anybody. He was just looking to strengthen the society. So, okay, he's the head of the Nazi Party, but he's not really a Nazi. Egan, or
Eneg.
Eneg, sorry. I use the proper letters at least.
Right.
Eneg is not a Nazi, and neither is Dara's, who is like the big leader, or the big heroine rather, of the Nazi Party at this point. They're all the little soldiers and sheeple and Unterscharführers that are obviously, like, that minute they're not going to continue with this whole war against Zeon thing. So really, there was just Melicon.
Yeah, well, maybe that shows that the Ecosians are a little kinder and more scrupulous than we thought. They, as soon as it starts, there's a group of them saying, like, "Can we get this guy out of here, please, and get back to the way we were?" So
that's about the only thing that doesn't hold up to me, is like but it's the same thing we always say: 48 minutes and out. I mean, there's only 1 2-part episode of the original series of Star Trek. This is obviously not going to be that. We're not going to come back. I do love the fact, though, that they're like, wow, so the Fuhrer was actually one of you guys. Well, thanks for helping us get rid of the despots. You may go now.
Yeah, right.
There's no like, wow, we're going to take some time to rebuild. We might need your help. We might do this. As Spock's going down the hall, he's like, I can see how they could be good in the Federation someday. It's amazing that you didn't hear one of them in the background going, we're good. I mean, because why would they want to be a member of the Federation? That's what brought Nazis.
Right.
Okay, despite those things, because now I'm just geeking out. Despite those things, I would guess it works.
All right. I would see the Ecosians joining the Federation, and then at some point just saying, hey, can can we talk seriously about this Prime Directive thing? No, seriously, can we have a talk about the Prime Directive?
You know, we did have leaders on our planet. You might have maybe let, I don't know, one or two of them know that you were here.
Right.
Screwing stuff up. Now, again, that wasn't the Federation doing that. That was just John Gill by himself. But
Right. And I kind of put this one into the same category of the two that I just mentioned, Gamesters and A Piece of the Action. To me, it's one of those episodes that kind of shouldn't work, but it does despite itself. The action is good. Like I said, the sort of game aspect of the episode is very good. There is some meat to chew on here, and we'll get to that in a moment with the message. It's just strange that this is one of those that I think is kind of easy to dismiss. You just kind of go, oh, there. Last week it was a gangster planet, now it's a Nazi planet. Have we run out of ideas? Well, they were trying to take on something kind of big here, and we're stuck, as you said, with the limit of the 48-minute TV format and a cast of a few instead of a cast of thousands. Mm-hmm. And you're kind of also stuck with this idea of, okay, we're going to take on this heavy thing and we're going to match it visually to something very recent history, the real world of World War II Nazi Germany, and present it as entertainment. So this is pretty gutsy stuff all around, and I think they did a good job with it. The trouble with the episode, like you point out, is when you do sort of start to pick it apart, and it doesn't always hold up there. But let's talk about the message, though, because I think that's what is important here. What message did you get from this one, Ken?
Don't be a Nazi.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one. That's a great one.
Yeah. Actually, the phrase that came to mind was, and I think I've sort of made this distinction before, you can build a society on hate. You can't build a civilization on hate. And taking shortcuts to civilization or to power is often going to lead to some sort of ruin, it seems. I mean, I go back again. We talked about this a couple of episodes ago or a few episodes ago. I can't remember in exactly which one. The whole policy of non-interference, what appeals to me about the Prime Directive is that it's a code that they live by, not just the actual, well, we're just going to leave this alone. I mean, let's assume, because you said earlier, you're having a hard time making John Gill and his reputation as being brilliant actually come together.
Yeah.
He didn't go there to screw things up. He didn't go there to get involved. He went there to watch, right? He was there as a cultural observer. And if we assume that he actually was brilliant, things must have been an incredibly, horribly, terrible mess there to the point that he felt that he had to get involved. Now, maybe start an after-school program. Or maybe start a school. Don't start a Nazi party. But it's hard to say, well, the policy of non-interference, that's really that's what we should absolutely live by. Because, I mean, we let genocides happen in that respect. Heck, World War II got as far as it did because we wanted to stay out of World War II. I mean, the United States wanted to stay out of World War II. So, I don't know. I mean, I was joking when I said don't be a Nazi. But, I mean, obviously, trying to build a society around hate, trying to build a society around fear of the other, is just not going to is not a good way to go. Which seems like an obvious thing, and yet there are plenty of places around this country right now that are being driven largely by that, and that So sadly, that message still has to hold up. I would love to wake up one day and go, "Wow, really? That happened." I would love to wake up 10 years from now and look back to today and be able to say, wow, really? That happened 10 years ago? Because, I mean, it's an incredibly important lesson and sadly one that we still seem to be missing.
Sure. Well, I agree with all of that. And the obvious message that I wrote down was if we don't learn from history, then we're doomed to repeat it. That had to have been fresh on people's minds then. It has to be fresh on people's minds now. We, as of recording today, we still live in a world where there are many, many people alive who were involved in World War II, either as soldiers or survivors of those camps, or just people on the home front who were waiting for their family members to come back. So I think that aspect of it, as living history to be learned from, is terrific. There's also the piece in there that we started to talk about power and corruption, which they do try to kind of hit you over the head with at the end. But I'm not 100% sold that is sort of a fact that can be applied to all situations all the time. Certainly, power is something that needs to have checks and balances. And we have to make sure that we call it out when power is abused. That's kind of a nice thing in this episode, is that, as you pointed out, we do see so many people who are Ekosians who are not true believers in the Nazi Party, and they are looking for ways to circumvent it and end it. So there is something good to be said there about calling out the abuses when they are made apparent. So do those messages hold up? I would think that they would.
Yes. Well, I mean, yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I thought I had already said that mine did. So do your messages hold up?
Yeah, Ken, I would say that my messages and your messages hold up.
Well, excellent. And we hope that you think so too. And if you don't, start back at the top of the show and figure out how to write to us and tell us, hey, right on, or hey, no way, as people are wont to do. Guess what, John?
What's that, Ken?
There is another episode of Mission Log coming up next week. Do you know its name?
By any other name?
Wow. It's kind of going Abbott and Costello, isn't it?
Some of the music for the Mission Log provided by Warp 11. Online at warp11.com, and from the album Messages by Key Theory, free to download at kitheory.com. Next week, a Starfleet historian sets a planet to rights by resurrecting the Spanish Inquisition. What could possibly go wrong? End transmission.
Now leaving Nerdist.com.